Good afternoon. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this afternoon's program online, as well as those of you who are here with us in person today. And I know that some of you are local, and some of you I just met and know that you came in from Florida all the way to be here, so glad to have you here. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and through many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library stands today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are all on stolen or settled indigenous lands. And I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. Senator Leahy has kindly agreed to sign copies of The Road Taken, a memoir, after this afternoon's program. Our bookstore will be selling copies if you're interested, and following the program, please exit through the doors in the back of the hall to join the signing or to exit the building. And I'll put in a little plug, having read the book. It's extraordinary, and I highly recommend it. We thank all of you in advance if you would just silence your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this afternoon. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And when the question and answer begins, we'll invite those of you who are joining in person today to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore a fascinating career of service with our distinguished guests, and I'm now honored to introduce today's speakers. I'm so delighted to extend a warm welcome to the Kennedy Library to Senator Patrick Leahy, who informed me I should just call him Patrick. Thank you. Elected to the United States Senate from Vermont in 1974, he currently serves as its most senior member. He is the President pro tem of the United States Senate and Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. He's served for 20 years as chair or ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, where he remains as the most senior Democrat. He is also the most senior Democrat on the Senate Agricultural Committee, where he previously served as chair for 7 years. His new book is The Road Taken, a Memoir. I'm so glad to welcome our moderator for this afternoon, Senator Christopher J. Dodd, who has been such a great friend to this library and provided such support to our mission. He represented the state of Connecticut during a long and distinguished career in the United States Senate, as well as 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. During his tenure as senator, he was chairman of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and a principal author of many bills that became law. He has served as the chairman and chief executive officer of the Motion Picture Association of America and is currently a member of Arnold and Porter's Legislative and Public Policy Group. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Alan, thank you very, very much. Well, delightful to be back in this room and to see so many friends of the Kennedy Library and great friends and admirers of Patrick Leahy, my colleague for 30 years in the United States Senate. Before beginning any remarks and questions for Patrick, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this book, which Patrick, I've told you, I've read. I thought it was going to be 100 pages long. I didn't know it was 400 pages long.
I got you.
But he dedicates the book to a person who's played such an important role in his life, and it made a difference every day, I think, for our country as well. Marcel, thank you immensely for Patrick's life. He was just a great, great person. And I don't know how many Leahy staff people may be in the room or listening virtually to what we're doing here, but Patrick pays great tribute to his staff over the years as well. And I'd be remiss as also acknowledging that while we are associated with the victories on bills and so forth, things we've done, having a remarkable staff. So Kevin and JP, I know both of you here as well. Thank you to the Leahy staff over the years for tremendous contribution. And very briefly, I want to echo that was just mentioned, obviously, by Alan. Having read this is a great book. If you're interested, we've all maybe read The Master of the Senate by Robert Caro and so forth. But if you want to get a real picture of the transition that has occurred over the years that Patrick served in the United States Senate, from 1975 to today, these stories and tales are far more than stories and tales. They're interesting on that level. But it really does explain the transitions that have occurred over the last 46 years. And there have been massive transitions. We're in the middle of one, obviously, today, which Patrick will talk about. But it gives you a way to understand it through the personalities, the individuals, some of whom objected to the changes, some created them. All of them, I think, at certain points in time, when we'll talk about this, had the common desire and appetite to want to make the institution work, despite the differences, which has been a big change for those of us who spent years this. Patrick and I were elected the same year, me to the House of Representatives, Patrick to the Senate. And then in 1980, which Patrick will talk about, is that tough election for Democrats. I was the year I was elected to the Senate. In the next 30 years, we served together. So Patrick, to begin with, thank you for the book.
Thank you.
It really is a wonderful, wonderful story of not about just individuals, but about these years and what happened in the country and major events in which you played a major role over and over and over again. So thank you. And I echo what was mentioned earlier by Alan, and that is, this, I think you'll enjoy it for those of you who are students or want to know the history of what's happened over the last half century. In fact, I mentioned to Patrick earlier today when we were coming in that we both served with Wright Patman. Now, you've really got to be a student of the Congress to appreciate Wright Patman. But Wright Patman was elected to Congress in 1928. He was born in 1893, and he died in 1976. But Patrick and I actually served with him. Now, he was in the House,
right,
not in the Senate, to give you some idea of the breadth of what happens in his history. We're almost getting near 100 years of service with people we served with and currently, obviously, still doing the job. So, again, Patrick, thank you. Thank your family. Thank your staff and others for contributing to the wonderful service you provided to Vermont and to our country. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
And I'm honored you asked me to be a part of this with you today, too.
Well, listen, you got to understand, Chris and I, for years, our offices were right next to each other. I mean, we'd walk in and out of each other's doors all the time, discussing things. And then, as we got more senior, we could have what are called hideaway offices in the Capitol, two very nice ones, and they were next door to each other. And you would hear the two of us going down the hall, going, Chris, remember that? Oh, you mean the guy? Yeah, wasn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And Professor Ambassador, listen, what the heck are they talking about? And we knew each other well enough we could finish each other's sentences. But also, I'm thinking being here in the Kennedy Library, and speaking of Kennedys, you had such a close relationship with Ted Kennedy, whom we both served with. And I know that when Senator Kennedy was ill and did not have much time to live, and he knew that, he would take comfort in having Chris Dodd come up and go sailing with him and talk with him. And I still remember the story, and both of you told me this, so it's safe to say it. They're out on a very stormy day. Senator Kennedy was loving it. The boat was rolling like this sailboat all over the place. And Chris said to him, Ted, I've got years to live. Just because you don't doesn't mean you got to kill us out here. And he would say that with that wonderful laugh of his. And it also, at the end of Senator Kennedy's life, when he had to be in the Senate floor, as ill as he was, for very, very close votes on issues that meant a lot to him, he would come on the floor just in time for the vote. Chris and John Kerry would walk carefully with him, and because everybody wanted to come to him and hug him, but we couldn't stand to have any kind of contagion, and they would just kind of gently hold everybody back as Republicans and Democrats alike applauded Senator Kennedy.
Yeah.
And I've never had the reason I got the cane, I know what that means to have somebody help you, because I had a bad accident earlier in the summer. After a month in the hospital, I started having to learn to walk again. And first used the wheelchair, now walk. But I'll be able to go snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, I hope, by the first of next year at our home in Vermont.
Hope so, too.
But Chris and I have been close friends. And again, you can tell who are really good friends because we do sometimes complete each other's sentences and have a great time doing it. And probably just as well, somebody couldn't translate what we were saying.
Yeah, probably.
So I'll turn it back to you.
You mentioned the third piece. We had offices next door to each other for years. Our offices in the Capitol were next door to each other. We also sat next to each other on the floor of the United States Senate.
That's right.
For many, many years. So we could also sort of mumble to each other back and forth in the middle of those sessions where we had to sit there for a long time.
It would be like when you're watching the distinguished senator from here and the distinguished senator from there, and we would whisper, what the hell is he talking about? That makes no sense at all. Of the distinguished senator.
Anyway, because I want to get to, in this limited time, it's almost unfair to you and your service, an hour and a half or so to talk about 46 years. But you got to take a few minutes and talk about growing up, because I think it also, like everyone else, played such a role in who you are, what your value system is. I was fascinated reading about your dad, left school at age 13 to work because his father had died, your grandfather, and so had to begin to help provide for the family as such. Talking about the Leahy press and so forth. I don't want to dwell on that. I could, but I think it's important for those of you who want to know about your life and your contribution. Those years at St. Michael's Grade School, St. Michael's High School, St. Michael's College. Why weren't you named Michael, my lord?
Listen, my grandfather, who died when my dad was early teens, I never knew him. He was named Patrick J. Leahy, and I was named the same. But my father, back when he was in his early teens, had to go out to get jobs to support his mother. Vermont was a lot different place, and signs would be on the doors, no Irish need apply. Mm-hmm. If you couldn't quite figure that out, say no Catholic need apply. But my maternal grandparents had emigrated to Vermont from northern Italy, starting master stone carver, as was my grandfather I never knew, and they faced the same kind of prejudices at that time. Trust me, Vermont's a lot different today. But my father told me you were never to show bias against somebody because of their nationality, skin color, religion. We're all Americans, we should be treated that way.
Right. Well, you had a great family growing up, and I realize it wasn't a wealthy family, but obviously great values, and they were taught your mother as well, obviously, and your family. So I know how important that was to you, and the book talks about those years, and it's meaningful. It begins to understand a lot about your value system. Words you hear over and over again in this book are about conscience and keeping your word, which we'll get to in a few minutes and examples of that. But nonetheless, I think too often we skip over that period of people's lives. And I know they made a big difference in your life growing up with that family. I love the story when you became the state's attorney at a very young age for Chittenden County in Vermont. The governor asked you to take on that job. You had just barely finished law school and spent those years doing it. And arguably, I'm told, again in the book, that you tried more cases before the Vermont Supreme Court than any other law firm in Vermont from time to time. But you had one case in particular, which I just enjoyed reading immensely. And that was a case the fellow came to you complaining that there was skinny dipping going on in Vermont in a certain pond, and that this would be outlawed in the state. And so you were saddled with solving this problem. It became a national story, by the way. This young state's attorney was wrestling with a skinny dipping case in Vermont. So why don't you share with us, because I love the story.
It was an afternoon, a weekend afternoon, a state trooper pulls up to our house, and I said, something wrong with it. Usually they'd come on a weekend like that because they needed me to sign warrants for a murder case or something. He said, well, we got this case of skinny dipping. I said, what? And he said, yes, I got a call, somebody very distraught that there was skinny dipping going on. I was out in the country. I pulled up, asked them about it. They said, well, you go about a half a mile across that field. Then you go another quarter of a mile or so through those woods. And then you got to be really quiet because you go through brush. And if they hear you coming, they'll put their clothes on. And I'm terribly offended they're out there naked. And I said, I think we'll hold off. I'll send you a memo. So I sent a tongue-in-cheek memo that I studied all the cases of skinny dipping in Vermont back to the times of Calvin Coolidge, discounted the stories of people who said they did that in May because of the danger of frostbite in Vermont in May, and reviewed Norman Rockwell paintings and so on, and basically said, if they're not bothering people, don't bother them. You got more important things to do. And did it all in tongue-in-cheek for social media, but it got picked up by the Associated Press, went all over the country. Times of London writes an editorial favorable to it, but the Washington Star, which is very, very conservative Republican based down here, but they wrote an editorial saying they wish that Attorney General John Mitchell, who's Richard Nixon's AG, and J. Edgar Hoover would show the same kind of sense as this unknown prosecutor in a small county in Vermont. Well, at the time I was vice president of the National District Attorneys Association. 4 of us in the executive board had a meeting scheduled with Mitchell and then Hoover. Mitchell thought it was very funny. Hoover, when I walked in, I said, I'm Patrick Leahy. I know who you are. And he was not amused. He was not amused.
Now, listen, the audience wants to know because, again, the question. You seem to know where that pond was pretty well, by the way. And so I don't want to, bring up, questions. Did you ever, were you skinny dipping, Patrick, in that?
I've been known to forget my bathing suits on a hot day on occasion. Nobody would want to see that today. I was a lot younger back then.
Well, listen, let's get right.
My wife is shaking her head, oh, Patrick.
No. I love that story in the book. Listen, let's get right, because the first race, 74. And of course, I remember it well, as I mentioned a moment ago, having been a candidate myself at a very young age. But it was the Watergate year, obviously. Yeah. And for those in the room who remember those days, it was the story, obviously, and what happened. And obviously, in the summer of 74, particularly when they realized there was a taping service. And then, of course, the president resigns on August 9th, I think it was, of 74. Gerald Ford pardons Richard Nixon in September, October, I've forgotten which. And so it was a big year. But to set the stage properly, there had never been in the history of Vermont a Democrat elected to the United States Senate, ever. Not to mention a Catholic Democrat in Vermont.
And somebody under 50.
Yeah, under 50. And so why don't you share the 2 elections, and you had a lot of them, obviously, the presidents you served with over the years, but the race in 74 and the race in 80. And I was involved in both of those because 80 I was elected to the Senate. And 80 was a tough year, very tough year.
One of the very few who made it through.
But tell us about that election in 74, because I know everyone said you couldn't win. I love the story of Joe Biden coming to your state to campaign for you. I love the fact, I get a sense you actually, at the end, sort of admired your Republican opponent. He was a decent person, apparently. So, but one of the things I had forgotten about, if I ever knew it, was one of your opponents was a fellow from Vermont by the name of Bernie Sanders.
That's true.
That year. And so tell us that story about that.
Well, Bernie was a third-party candidate for what was the Liberty Union Party? So it was a far-left party. And I said to him, I said, Bernie, why are you in this? Every vote you get is one I would have gotten. He said, well, you can't win anyway. No Democrat can. And I got to get myself known, although we stayed very friendly through it. In fact, so friendly that one of the debates, he had his young son with him who was falling asleep in the car, and he didn't know what to do. Marcel and I had our kids with us. Our oldest one was about 10 years old. He said, Bernie, he could stay out here and watch out for your son during the debate. Remember, this is Vermont. Our poor son had been dragged around to debates before. He said, I'll volunteer, Dad, I'll volunteer, and stayed out. And we've always kept a friendship, Bernie and I, after that. But my predecessor had actually been elected to a partial term, then later terms, had been elected the year I was born, and I'm running for his seat.
George Aiken.
George Aiken, right. And everybody said you can't possibly win. The prevailing polls showed that Vermont at that time was in favor of the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. I was opposed to it, and I said so. And I remember two headlines. One, 5 days before the election, big type across the front page, poll dooms Leahy. It was an uncomfortable weekend. Yeah. The next one was...
Had you down by 35 points, I think.
Yeah,
in the poll.
And then next one, 5 days later, Leahy unexpectedly wins Senate seat. And I thought, okay, now what do we do? Just like the Robert Redford movie. But one of the first major votes that came up, was temporarily in armed services, was to reauthorize the war in Vietnam. And John Stennis, who you knew well too, talked to me about it. The president invited me down and talked to me. I'd never been in the presidential office. Yeah. Henry Kissinger came by, Jim Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense, telling me why I should vote for it to continue the war. I told him politely no. Major newspapers said if I voted to end the war, I'd never be reelected. And so we had 5 votes in a row on the committee. I voted to end the war in each of the 5 votes, and each of the votes to end the war won by 1 vote. Right. You can imagine the looks I was getting from the chairman. But interestingly enough, there was a very conservative independent senator on there named Harry Byrd.
Harry Lloyd Byrd, yeah.
Who had always supported the war, and he voted. They hadn't counted on this. They assumed he'd vote for it. He voted no each time, and Stennis turned to him and said, Mr. Byrd, did you intend to vote no? He said, that's right, Mr. Chairman. They've lied to me long enough. Stennis turned to his staff person, I think you best get the president on the phone. He'll want to know this. Now, the war probably would have ended anyway, but that ended.
That was it.
And I was proud of that vote, even though there was huge pressure the other way. But I swore I'd follow my conscience.
Yeah. Which brings me to a point, because you cite throughout the book at various times Edmund Burke.
Oh, yes, which we both know well.
And Edmund Burke, the great answer he gave to the electors of Bristol, England, when asked, do you vote like your constituents want, or do you make up your own mind and do what you want to do? And without quoting him directly, his answer was basically, I offer them certainly my industry and my recommendation or my guidance, but never my conscience.
Yep.
I just got to tell you, Patrick, and I was thinking, just to take 1 second aside here, I would use that all the time as a candidate talking about Edmund Burke. And I'll never forget in Connecticut, one time at a middle school in Connecticut, I again recited the answer of Edmund Burke and went through and explained why. And I'll never forget, I can see her today, maybe 13, 14 years old, with bright red pigtails hair. She came down, she raised her hand, and I said, yes, young lady, why don't you? She said, did you know that Edmund Burke lost his next election after he said that?
I found
never
that
known
out
before.
halfway through the election. I said, I'm still sticking with it.
Along the way. But you really, there's some wonderful moments here. And again, there's not the time we have here to go through all of them. But that conscience and keep your word, I think, are such incredible sort of, they're cornerstones of the service in the place. It's a small group of
If it
people.
works right.
Yeah, absolutely, if it works right. And obviously, it's not a question of difference of opinions. It's whether or not people are following their conscience, what they believe to be the right thing to do. And so there's a couple of stories, but one that I did never know before, and you tell it in the book, and it's so instructive. I mean, again, I didn't serve, you did with Jim Eastland. He was gone by the time in 1980. But there's a story about Ted Kennedy and Jim Eastland. I don't remember the particular matter it was that Ted Kennedy had before the Judiciary Committee, it must have been. And why don't you tell that story? I just think it's a great story.
Jim Eastland actually became president pro tem, as I am now. I first met him when he said, boy, how old are you? A couple of weeks after I got there. And I said, well, I'll be 35 next year, Mr. Chairman. Anybody ever tell you, boy, you too young to be in the U.S. Senate? And I said, yeah, my opponent for one. He loved it, because I didn't back down. But the story, and both Senator Eastland and our friend Senator Kennedy told me this story. Ted had an issue that he wanted to put through Judiciary Committee. Eastland opposed it, thought it was too liberal. And he said, well, look, if you could show me you've got the votes in the committee, I'll put it on the agenda. Ted came to him with a list of, here's the senators who vote aye with me. Here's the ones, including yourself, Jim, who vote against me. I win by one vote. So he put it on the agenda. They call the roll. Senator Kennedy loses by one vote. Eastland looks down at the note he had. He said, I pointed to one of the senators. He said, didn't you agree to vote with Senator Kennedy? Yeah, I told him I would, but I changed my mind. Eastland just looks up and turns to the clerk. He said, change my vote to aye. And we keep our word in this committee. That senator was never allowed to have an issue before the committee. After he finally left the committee and went on another committee.
Well, it's a great story, and I think it's why this book is important. Jim Eastland was, of course, a segregationist. He had a dreadful record when it came to the issue of equal justice, and long stories about it. Don't need to dwell on it. But the point is, in an institution, you're dealing with a lot of people you fundamentally disagree with. But if there's a common denominators of conscience, of keeping your word, and so forth, an institution and a highly complex, pluralistic society like our own works. Doesn't always produce the results individually of us like, but trying to move forward, becoming that more perfect nation that our founders have talked about, require that kind of understanding and comedy. It's a hard thing to explain, and particularly today, and again, I'll just my own point of view, I'm watching it sort of disappearing, if not disappeared altogether, in terms of being able to reach conclusions on what day of the week it is, let alone complex matters that we certainly are confronting every single day. So I thank you immensely for telling that story in the book, and you do it with a lot of other cases along, and I won't go through all of them, but they're wonderful examples. I was fascinated, for instance, about your relationship with George Aiken and Lola Aiken. You succeeded him, obviously a very conservative Republican, ironically close to Mike Mansfield, which I never knew before. Yeah. And what was your opinion of George Aiken? Now, you succeeded him and so forth. There were various events they were involved in. But I got a sense that you had sort of a respectful relationship with George Aiken.
We did. I mean, I'd known him. He was elected the year I was born. And I'd known him all my life. My parents knew him. Lola Aiken and my mother were the only two Italian Americans working for the National Life, which was a very conservative Republican company at that time. So they became fast friends. I loved some of the things he did, especially for rural America in our state and elsewhere. I disagreed with him on Vietnam, but I was very upfront with him on that. And he and I met when I came down there. He told me how, again, you keep your word.
Yeah.
And his friendship with Mike Mansfield, he kept his word. And I wanted to make sure we did the same. I helped get things expand projects and programs in
Right.
Vermont, the University of Vermont, named after him, and said, but make sure it
Yeah.
continues his name. So we had that thing, but he obviously disagreed with me on
I'm sure,
on
yeah,
the
that's-
Vietnam,
yeah.
but we always go along well, and the fact that it's a small state, everybody knows everybody. His wife, my mother,
Yeah.
and all, and you see these connections. I think he was surprised that a Democrat, and one so young,
Yeah.
would win. He endorsed
Yeah.
my Republican opponent, and I fully understood that. I felt no resentment for that. It just seemed, he's Mr. Republican, and
Yeah.
that's what he should do. So, but the other senator from Vermont, who had also been our Attorney General,
Bob
Lieutenant
Stafford.
Governor, and Senator Bob Stafford, again, ardent Republican, he took me under his wing. His wife called Marcel, offered to babysit our children if we were house hunting down there. We decided that our children were wild enough after being with babysitters all the way through the election. Maybe if we want to keep the relationship going, we'd take care of the kids. But we traveled together around the country.
Yeah.
Traveled together, held hearings together in Vermont on Vermont issues. And partly what that taught me, try to work with the other party. When I became chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Codell's a congressional delegation, usually you're going overseas somewhere. I set them up first in Vermont with this committee. We'd go to a state that elected a Republican, but they're on the Agriculture Committee. We'd hold hearings in their state. The next one, we'd do it with a Democrat. Had a military plane, went around, stayed in people's farmers' homes. It's amazing how
was
in
a
a
great idea.
committee that had been politicized by Jesse Helms, my predecessor, we came together. And as a result, we were able to write the organic farm bill, for among others, which is now a $60 billion or so dollar industry in this country. But more importantly, also, we enlarged the school feeding programs, school breakfast, school lunch. I know in parts of my state, and it probably could be said of everybody else's, kids would be on school time because they would be guaranteed at least 2 meals. Parents didn't have the money to give them a breakfast and lunch, but in school they would. Some of those same kids are now the leaders in our state.
That's very important.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. The 80 election was a huge election, obviously, and very difficult. I don't want you to, we could spend all afternoon just on that one alone, but I want you to get, because something I didn't know about you, despite the fact we sat together, literally lived in the same house almost with our 2 officers adjoining. I didn't ever know that you had a bad eye, that growing up born with a defect. I can relate to it. I have a sister who was born legally blind in the 1930s with cataracts. Today they'd fix it in a minute. And went on to 40 years as a teacher and so forth, what she did with her life. Still with us at advanced ages, but a remarkable woman, still active, engaged. But that, and then it begins to make, obviously, the conscience thing, to keep your word. But I want to jump ahead a little bit here, because there's a wonderful story you told. Again, you went with Tom Daschle, John Glenn, and you're in Vietnam. John McCain and John Kerry were making a difference in normalizing relationships with Vietnam. Hard to believe, but they did. And you contributed to that. And I don't know if there's any nexus between the fact that you grew with this eye defect, if you will, as a result of birth as a child. But those scenes where you and John Glenn are helping veterans of the Vietnamese side of that conflict who didn't have wheelchairs and so forth was very moving to me. And then your work, obviously, on landmines and Agent Orange as well, that had an awful lot to do with the fact that today we have a very decent relationship with Vietnam. They haven't changed their government, but nonetheless, we have a relationship because of what you did, John Glenn did, John McCain and John Kerry did. Tell us that story, because that thing says an awful lot about you and your service as well.
I thought, well, I'd worked with Bobby Mueller, who headed the Vietnam Veterans of America.
Right.
He'd been paralyzed as a Marine in Vietnam. He said, could we do something about the landmines that are there? I said, well, we don't have full relations with them. We can't do direct foreign aid
Yeah,
to them, but we could give the money to the Vietnam veterans who would pay for all this help. And I went down to see President George H.W. Bush, and then Secretary James Baker, and talked to them about it. Well, President Bush had been in combat. He said, no, I think that's a good idea. And Baker said, I think it's a good idea. I said, well, so-and-so in the State Department doesn't like the idea because, you know, we don't have relations with them yet, and what are they doing for us, and so on. And Bush turns to Baker, and he says, Jimmy. And I'd never heard him, I don't know if you ever heard James Baker ever called Jimmy.
Yeah.
He says, get him on that assistant on the phone. So he gets him on the speakerphone. Guy has no idea that Bush and I are sitting there. He gives Baker all the reasons why they can't do this cockamamie idea of mine. And Baker says, I see, well, I got somebody here who likes the idea, Mr. President. He comes out here like this, and so we had it. But we went over, and there was still this, people had fought against each other. And John Glenn and I and the others were standing there, and they asked, after they introduced me, asked me if I would pick up when these men had been crawling or just walking on a stool. He was going to get his first wheelchair. And he's staring at me, just staring at me all the way through the introduction. I thought, God, this guy must hate me. American, over 6 feet tall and everything else. So I pick him up. I put him in the wheelchair. I start to get up, grabs my shirt, he pulls me down and kissed me. Same thing happened to John Glenn, and you and I knew John
very well.
well. He was not an emotional guy.
No.
He had tears when the guy he picked up did the same to him. In fact, I still remember what John said to us on the bus going back to the hotel. Anybody complained about anything this trip after what we just saw, I'm throwing you off the bus. And we're all, okay, Colonel Glenn, we'll go on. But the thing is, it opened a sense of trust. I've been there several times. I'm going later this month. In Da Nang, we worked this project with them to clean up Agent Orange. There's so much in the airport. The head of my Vermont staff, John Tracy, had fought against the Vietnamese there. He came with me. And I pointed him out to the top general in Vietnam. He said, where's he sitting? Over there. The general gets up. Every Vietnamese stands up at attention. He walks down to John and salutes him. That's a little bit of a change.
Yeah.
And the thing is, step by step, 2 steps forward.
Yeah.
At first it was 1.5 back, now it's about maybe a quarter back. And closing with a delegation I brought to the William Fulbright's college that we started. And we talked to all of them. None of them spoke in English as children.
Yeah.
I asked one young woman who's equivalent of a sophomore in college, I asked her a question. She said, well, when you stop to think of it, that would be indicative of, we're all like, whoa. And they all want to know about the United States. They all want to know about our freedom of speech.
Yeah.
So it's paid off, and the fact that I've had Republicans and Democrats, we've worked together. Every trip I've taken there, I brought Republicans and Democrats with me.
Yeah.
And
Made
it's
a
worked.
difference. Well, also, and again, there's so much to talk to you about, but the contribution you made on landmines alone, if you did nothing else in your entire public career but that thing, and obviously you did many more things than one, was just a remarkable contribution, not only to this country but to the world. So thank you immensely as your colleague,
you.
what you did on landmines.
I'm proud of that.
Just fantastic. Cuba, again, you could have had a career just talking about Cuba. I think Patrick probably spent more time in Cuba trying to get to the point where we might find some new way. If we did in Vietnam, given the horror of that war and what happened to an awful lot of our fellow citizens and to the citizens of Vietnam here, then it looked like maybe with Cuba, where we've had a hostile relationship for years, could we not get this back on a different track again?
I hope so.
We could spend the next 2 hours just talking about that alone, but what motivated you? Why Cuba? Why did you want to get involved in that?
Well, you come from a little state like mine,
Yeah.
and you wonder, why would anybody pick on you? And here's Cuba, a tiny country. There's no danger to us. Of course we had problems with them, but why not open up? They're right here in our hemisphere. We put conditions on them that we don't on countries that are dangerous to us or are created all kinds of civil rights. We're not going to make them a democratic nation, but we ought to at least show sensibility to them. And the first time we went down there was Jack Reed
Right.
of Rhode Island, and Jack's about 5'6",
Yeah.
but speaks fluent Spanish, as do you. And Marcel and I get invited to a late dinner with Fidel Castro, and it was
Jack, by the way, is a graduate of West Point, Harvard Law School, a brilliant, and now
Yeah.
the chairman of the Armed Services Committee.
and a paratrooper.
Yeah.
And so
And a paratrooper. Yeah.
I said, well, Jack, tell President Castro how you introduced me. And so he goes in perfect Spanish. He said, look, the big guy thinks he's important, so be nice to him. But I'm the guy you want to talk with. I've got all the power. Now, nobody would tease Castro. He turns to me and said, do you know what he said? I said, oh, yeah, he introduced me that way everywhere. Well, the whole atmosphere changed, and we started swapping jokes back and forth.
Yeah.
And we ended up keeping a correspondence from that. In fact, he told me they had the best ice cream in the world. I said, oh, we got Ben and Jerry's, knowing that Ben Cohen would be glad to bring the ice cream down and talk revolutionary to revolutionary. And he said, I've never heard of it. I said, I'll send you some. I don't care. On the way out, he takes Marcel's arm. He said, if he sends you ice cream, be sure to pack it in dry ice. And when we came back, we talked about that. I said, I'm going to send some. And our Secretary of State, our dear friend, Madam Albright, calls me up and says, you can't do that. It breaks the embargo. I said, I'm going to do it. I don't hear you. I don't hear you. And we did get it down because the Cuban baseball team came up to play in Baltimore. We gave them 3 things filled with every kind of ice cream that Ben and Jerry's made, all sealed up. They could take 2 for the team. The other one went to Castro.
Yeah.
Took a while. I get this handwritten note with a box of every kind of rum they make. Thank goodness it wasn't cigars. And it says, the product of your state is very good. Try the product of my state.
Yeah. Very interesting.
But that helped. When Raul Castro came in, he wouldn't meet with any American officials. But I was there and he'd meet with me because the connection with his brother. And I brought Dick Shelby and his wife. Dick, as you know, a very conservative Republican. And he was somewhat hesitant on that.
Right.
And here's how you do diplomacy. I said, well, we'll remember what you did wrong. You remember what we did wrong. You're a bigger country. You did more things wrong.
Yeah.
I said, well, people of our age, I'm older than you are. I said, well, maybe for our children and grandchildren might see a different world. I've got a great-granddaughter. And I'm thinking, boy, I'm really doing a good job as a diplomat here. Marcel said, oh, Mr. President, do you have a picture of her? Why, yes, I do. It brings over the whole atmosphere changed. Then it turned out that Dick Shelby's wife, who's a professor, had taught Cubans at Georgetown. By the time we finished, He's walking us by the arm down to this car. But the point is, I went back and said to various presidents, look, do some personal diplomacy, for God's sake. Don't listen to those who are locked into 50 years ago. Sort of what you've done all over the world.
And I'll tell you, just to get a quick anecdote, and obviously I want to hear what you have to say on this thing, but President Bush once said to me, he was upset with me over something I was doing in Latin America. And he turned to me and he said, listen, I can only make one call in Latin America. Who do I call? I said, well, that's a great question. I don't have a quick answer for you. Well, let me think about it. And a month or so later, I ran into the president again, and he said, do you have an answer to that question? I said, I do. He's no longer a head of state, but he was the president of Uruguay, a guy named Sanguinetti. I said, people respect him in South America. He's not a big country. Obviously, Uruguay is small. But he pays attention to issues and people like him. Worth a call. About a month later, I ran into Sanguinetti. He was in New York. He stopped me and he said, you're not going to guess who calls me all the time. Calls me on my wedding anniversary, on my birthday. And George Bush, 41, would do that.
And probably
when there was not a vote involved. He'd call and just say hello. When there was a vote involved, a lot of them call when they need a vote at the UN or someplace. And that's not politics. You don't want to make that the first call. If you don't. So he did a lot of these other calls. He developed friendships around the world, and you did that all the time.
But you have to. You're one of the ones who constantly practice that. You don't call just when you need somebody. No. You develop a relationship before.
Let me ask you, and this I hesitate because we're getting near the time we're going to turn to the audience here. You served with a range of people in politics in the Senate, and I just loved in the book how you treat them in the book. Again, even people you fundamentally disagreed with on many issues, you found qualities in them that you could work with them on something. And so I was thinking the list. You mentioned Bob Stafford already, who I admired immensely. I served with him on the Labor Committee.
You did.
And a wonderful human being, a wonderful person. But I mentioned Jim Eastland already, that story you tell about Teddy Kennedy and he as well. Mike Mansfield, John Stennis and Hubert Humphrey were two people you talked about. Very different, their politics and so forth over the years. But I was struck by your relationship with both Humphrey in a way. Now, you supported Bobby Kennedy in 1968 for president. Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the nomination and narrowly losing, of course, to Richard Nixon. But tell me just quickly about Stennis and Humphrey and why you're so much admiration.
They were old school. They kept their word. They knew the institution. Senator Humphrey was, and I had also supported Robert Kennedy.
Right, I know he did.
We became very, very good friends with Humphrey. Senator Humphrey was dying of cancer. He'd gone back to Waverly. He'd call us from there, but a vote was coming up. It was going to be very, very close. The White House offered to send a plane to fly Humphrey back. He was telling Stennis about this, who was on the other side, and it involved oil and gas industry. And Stennis said, no, stay there. I'll pair with you. And, that's where you say, I would vote aye. Other senator would vote no. He's not here, so I'll withhold my vote. So it's the same as though nobody voted on it. And Stennis offered a pair. I said, well, and he did. And I said, John, that was such a good thing to do for Hubert. He said, well, he's a senator. It's all capital letters. Yeah. And but he said, these people had supported me for the last 30 years or 40 years from the industry came to my office, and when they heard I was going to do this, they said, you can't do that. We could lose if you did that. I said, can you imagine? They wanted me to break my word. I told them to leave my office and never set foot in here again. Now, unfortunately, the Senate's not like that today. One of the reasons I wrote this book, and Marcel had urged me to write it, and others had, JP and Kevin Mack, and I kept notes almost every day that I was in the Senate. And I finally decided to show the difference. Hopefully new senators will read it and see the way it could be. We were never perfect, but we were more toward the conscience of the nation than we are now. Now it's what's going to be for a soundbite on the news today? What's going to be the next tweet? What's going to be this? And people will flip around to whatever it is. And we saw that. I had finished the book, just about, and January 6th happened. People storming the Capitol say, well, under the Constitution, we have the right to. No, there's no right to come in and destroy property, kill police officers who were there, damage others. No, there's no right in the Constitution for that. And some of the senators who before that wanted to disqualify the election. And I said, I want everybody to see what happens when it all falls apart.
Right.
Because I think this country faces dangers. I really do.
Yeah.
In the attacks on our Constitution. I'll be back in Vermont carefully watching, but I want the people who are going to be there to know you've got to do it differently.
Well, that's the, you know.
And then I preside over the second impeachment.
I was going to ask you about those things. We're running out of time, but because I also want to ask you about your views of some of these presidents. You served with, the only person I know of that was on 5 Batman movies and also served with 8 presidents. That's a unique contribution to the country.
Sometimes Batman was more fun.
But the most vile word in politics today is the word compromise. And yet the very institution you and I served in is designed to do that. It's painful if you believe very strongly in something. The notion of compromise seems like a terrible weakness. And yet in a highly pluralistic society, how do you move anything along? If you want autocracy, we could do that, I suppose. I don't know if anyone really believes that's the right answer. But you served, I mentioned some of the senators, you served with 8 presidents, and you particularly, it seemed to me in the book, you focused a lot on Jimmy Carter. And I love the story how you met, but nonetheless your relationship with him. Obviously, Barack Obama was important as well in your life, what you thought of him and worked with him. You obviously admired John Kennedy immensely. And talk about the day we all can remember, those of us with a few years on us here, I remember that day so well, that Friday, as many Americans have been aged do very well. But tell us a bit about the 2 questions I have for you, I want you to complete with. Do that if you would for me. And then you started to do so, but I know you're an optimistic person. And while we both have seen things that are terribly disturbing and troublesome, I'd like to hear about how you think we might be able to get back on track again if you thought what can do. We can all agree on what we worry about, but how do we start to get this right?
Forget the single issue groups of either the right or the left.
Yeah.
You're there to represent the whole country. And you may have people you disagree with. At least take the time to find out, is there an area we can come together? Think in the long term. It's a 6-year term. I know so many senators who think it's a 6-minute term because that's the next newscast.
Yeah.
That's a mistake. Spend more time with each other in both parties, like we do on these congressional delegations. I bring both
I couldn't agree with
Republicans
you
and
more.
Democrats.
Couldn't agree with you more.
But I think, well, there's been a number of changes. Those who want everything, break the rules, do whatever you want. We saw this with the Supreme Court. I think Donald Trump has created terrible problems in this country because he has followers who think that no matter what the laws or the Constitution say, that's really some nefarious group that put that together. As I said, the people were storming the Capitol, saying, well, we have this constitutional right. I wish someone would say, have you ever read the Constitution? Tell me where that is. And we've got to get back to a couple of things. We've got to have our children read more, read diversified things, learn, teach the Constitution, teach the respect for the government. Don't let an arbitrary group say, well, you can't talk about this part of our country's history, but only this part. Learn it all. And then in the Senate, the leaders have to do more to bring senators together, both parties, and have them have meetings together. I mean, you and I sat in a lot of those meetings, might have cocktails, might have soda, but we talk with each other. You remember the balcony I had in my hideaway overlooking the mall, very nice place. But at sunset time, you could see the sun setting and the sunset, and you've got the Washington Monument, the Capitol, the whole mall, Lincoln Memorial, and I'd invite senators out there for prayer hour in holy water. Somebody said, well, holy water, that's not my religion. They said, well, Pat's got 12-year-old holy water. He's got single malt holy water. And, oh, yes, there is a provision for that. And some don't drink alcohol, but we sit out there, talk about the sunset. Oh, did your daughter get into that school? She did wonderful.
Well, I didn't tell the story when you were designated by Mike Mansfield as the bartender.
I was.
In your first year in the United States Senate in 1975, when the other members would gather in the afternoon, maybe a little
and
impatient.
you see Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey teasing each other, but then agreeing on something.
Yeah.
And that's really where I learned it. You talk together like that,
Yeah.
and you work things out. It might mean you've got to give some on your side, they've got to give some on that. You may only win 80% of what you want. So what? Come back next year for the other 20%.
Yeah.
And you're better off.
I want to give you something we didn't mention. I'd agree with
Thank
him
you.
totally on this. I've often asked, are there any votes you regret? I mean, there's a common question, or moments you regret. I was in a majority that voted based on what I was being told. Not that you should ever make that the reason for your vote, but it seemed to me there was overwhelming evidence at the point, and that was the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You were one of 14 senators who voted no. It was a courageous vote you cast, and I regret I didn't join you in that vote. I took the other side of it and regret it. Tell us about that, because it was a big moment, and there's a story about. I think you and Marcel may have been a part of this on a walk you were taking in McLean or something, and you met some people that had an impact on your decision.
Oh, I sure did.
I know we're getting close to the hour going here, but I want you to
I'll try
share with
making-
the audience about how that happened, because it's so instructive. And again, I never knew the story before. I wish I had been walking with you that day.
Well, Dick Cheney and others in the administration had met with us all privately to explain why Saddam Hussein was about to have these weapons of mass destruction. There were no such weapons, but that's why we had to go to war. I didn't really believe it, and we walk out in our neighborhood in Northern Virginia. Often we're out there walking in the neighborhood. Two fit young men who I'd never seen before jogging up. Good morning, Senator. Good morning, Mrs. Leahy. I said, good morning. Senator, I heard you had questions in the closed session of something Vice President Cheney had said. I said, well, if there was such a session, I couldn't talk about it. Understood, sir. But did they show you file number 8? Use the code word. You can see when I looked at my face, I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. You ought to go take a look at it. So I went and saw file number 8. Contradicted a lot of what the administration was saying. We're out walking the next day. Good morning, Senator. Good morning, Mrs. Leahy. I understand you read file number 8. They used the code word. And I didn't answer. You could see by the look on my face I had. And he said, but did they show you file number 12? So I went back to see it. And I told my staff and I was going to vote against the war. Or going to war in Iraq, because there were no weapons of mass destruction. That Sunday after church, we were walking out in the area not far from Robert Kennedy's old home. Big black cars pull up. Window goes down, and one of them, armored Suburban, is somebody close to, well, very important in the Bush administration. Hi, Pat. Hi, Marcel. Said hello. Pat, can I talk with you? His security people all get out of the car. Marcel said, I'll continue home. We're about a mile from our house. So he said, I understand you've seen file 8 and file 12. I said, I have. I can't talk you out of voting against the war. I said, no, you can't. Will we still be friends? Yes, but I said, you're wrong on this. I started to get, I said, we'll give you a ride home. And I said, well, let me tell you where I live. we know where you live. I voted no.
Yeah, it was the right vote.
Well,
Thank you immensely.
thank you.
You've done a great job.
Thank you all.
Now this is the part I love the best. You're going to now have the advantage of asking all the questions you want to ask out here. We can't do all of them. If you could try and keep the questions somewhat brief, we'll
And I'll try to keep the answers brief.
Yeah, if we can. We already have one up here. You've come from Florida. You deserve to be the first one, I think, up here and making the question.
Well, if it's
Why
my
don't you tell us
privilege-
who you are and the question?
Sure. I'm Peter Metz from Needham, Massachusetts,
All
and a
right.
member of Massachusetts Peace Action. And if I'm the first to ask a question, it's my privilege to tell you, or I'm glad to tell you how privileged I am to sit in the presence of two such faithful servants to the American public. A lot of us admire you both.
Thank you.
So I have a question for both of you. I'm devoting as much of my time in retirement as I can to eliminating nuclear weapons, and I have a lot of colleagues who are doing it, but we're obviously not being very effective. In the last couple days of his vice presidency, Joe Biden gave a long policy speech, little noted, on nuclear weapons.
On what?
On nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Formal speech. And in it, he said, if we want a world without nuclear weapons, the United States must lead us there. He didn't say could or should, he said must. And then he went on to say, and because we're the only nation who have used nuclear weapons, we have a great moral responsibility to lead the charge. The world paid no attention. And of course, now nuclear weapons are finally on everybody's mind because of what Putin has been threatening, and everybody's wondering, what are we going to do about it? So my question to you is, what can we do to support Joe Biden so he has the strength to lead that charge now?
Okay. Patrick? No, you go ahead. This is your moment, boy. You're still in the Senate. I'm not, so I don't have that.
No, I wrestle with that. Obviously, he was right on that. We have to set the example. But then when you're facing a war criminal like Putin, I don't worry as much about North Korea because their use of nuclear weapons, say, against us, their country would be annihilated. And he knows that. It's much better for bluffing. Putin, I question his sanity in what he's doing. He's a war criminal, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, having his troops machine gun families, children, parents on the street. Would he use nuclear weapons if he's backed into a corner? What's he going to do where one of the parts of Ukraine where he rigged an illegal vote there, fraudulent vote, that they could succeed, he claims it, and then suddenly his own troops are being chased out of that part in the last day or so. I don't know what the answer is. No matter what we did, Putin is going to be the irrational in this. He's going to make the calculation, how badly can he lose? At the same time, are his generals going to finally stand up to him
Yeah.
and say, are your fantasies worth destroying our country? I know that doesn't give an answer. I don't know the answer. It's one of the things I'm struggling with. I have meetings planning when I get back to Washington to discuss exactly that question.
Thanks, Patrick.
And unfortunately,
Let me just add one point to you, now, because this is about Patrick. So, we may actually have a situation in the Ukraine with the threat of Putin using nuclear weapons. Let's all hope this comes out with a positive result, that the Ukrainians are able to succeed in this effort of pushing back. Maybe there are others in the world who recognize how precarious exactly the moment you've described is. It may provide us a moment we haven't had in recent years. and that is the actual threat of using nuclear weapons may convince countries that have them today, some of them, not all of them, unfortunately, that it's worth pursuing. I'm fascinated by that meeting between Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev and Reykjavik. Ken Edelman has written a fascinating book about that story and what actually happened in that decision when Gorbachev leads over and says, why don't we just get rid of all of them? It's a fascinating moment. Didn't actually come out that way, but nonetheless, we may be looking at another moment that comes along. The window will open, possibly to create the kind of world response to the danger that was posed by Putin, to allow us to begin to seriously talk about exactly what you're proposing. So, okay, hopefully. What's next? Other questions? And you got to have questions for Leahy. Here we go.
Senator Leahy, if you were to load up a minivan and drive across the country, and you could take your 3 favorite Republican senators from your time there and your 3 favorite Democratic senators from your time there, who would be in that minivan cross-country trip, Senator Dodd excluded?
I was going to put Chris first on
It's been
the
one of my
list.
ambitions to rent a Winnebago and drive across the country.
I don't know any senator, myself included, who put up with a 6-person minivan traveling. But I had a lot of senators I did enjoy traveling with over the years. Dick Shelby, a Republican who's ultra-conservative, wife, a wonderful professor. We loved traveling with him because we could joke and tell stories and come to conclusions on things and never have a word of it leak out what we're doing. Certainly traveling with Hubert Humphrey, that was a lesson in itself, including one day Moscow, I get a call after we'd been out till 3 in the morning. Get a call at 7 o'clock. Why aren't you down here in the lobby? I said, what's the matter? He said, bring your camera. This is your only chance to go jogging in Red Square with Hubert Humphrey. And I'm like, so I throw some clothes on, grab the camera, go down. He's in warm-up suit. He'd take about 5 steps onto the, and people go, Humphrey, Humphrey. And they had no idea who the heck I was. And he'd stop and talk to them, and they couldn't understand a word he was saying, but they loved it and clapped with it. But his enthusiasm, and then see serious discussions with Brezhnev at the time. I mean, that's somebody I always loved traveling with. Bob Stafford, when he was alive, he'd never been to China or Tibet. We never had a congressional delegation to Tibet. I organized one so he could. But there are so many others that have been there. I mean, Chris is somebody I'd really enjoyed traveling with. Ted Kennedy, when you go with him, he knew when the delegation was coming because you could hear his laughter. And Barry Goldwater and I would get along very well in these things. I'd tell him my idea and something, he said, well, I'm sorry you're so stupid, not know better, but have a drink. And, but then we would work things out, and Marcel and I were at his funeral. So there are many. Yeah, I served with
400.
400 senators. That's 20% of all the senators who served in the history of this country. And some of them were there only a very short time, like a few months, others for a couple of terms. There are some that I would not want to travel with. And others, I don't know why I'd want to, but there are many, many in both parties. I'd have to really think on the answers, but there's many that people would be surprised if they saw us on these planes sitting around the conference room talking and seeing the way everybody brought something to it. Yeah. Those who are totally ideologues on things, nobody wants to be with them, except for the cable news or something.
That's a great answer. And I was teasing, in fact, I was talking to JP, and I got the book that I hope you all will get and read. And of course, when any of us get a book, where we think we might be mentioned in the book, we go right to the book back in the back to find out what people have said about you in the book. And then the second thing is you go to the pictures in the book because you figure, well, you know, there are 40-some pictures in this book. I'm not in one of them. I'm not thinking you got Andropov in one of them. Andropov was the head of the Soviet Union for about an hour one time. His picture's in this book.
Well,
Your best buddy, your next door neighbor's not in the book.
He wanted you, but I said you didn't want to be in the picture with him.
Yes, sir.
It is an amazing book, and it made me love the U.S. Senate again, and I had lost that.
Yeah.
I grew up reading Advise and Consent, the novel, Profiles in Courage.
Yeah.
I loved the U.S. Senate,
Yeah.
and this gave it back to me.
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Is there a senator you would be willing to name that you wouldn't put on that bus or put on a bus somewhere else? And if that's too hard for you, tell us about Batman.
Well, I had my 14-page thing of an answer of the ones I wouldn't put on the. But there are some who just they're not friendly to others. They wouldn't talk with people on the other side. That's why Batman was fun. I had my first library card when I was 4 years old. I've read a lot. I've actually written things for the Batman anthologies and all. I got a kick out of being in these movies, and the beauty of it is, as I said, my first library card when I was 4, but it's a little tiny room inside the big adult library. Every single cent I've made from those Batman movies, I donate to this library. Now it's a whole new, beautiful wing. The ability to teach children with learning disabilities, and also for those, as you know, their first year in high school, but they're already taking college courses. It covers the whole spectrum. But the most fun, Chris, was when I was doing reading hour with these 4 and 5, 6 years old. I got stuck on something. I grabbed my cell phone and said, "Are you nearby? I need your help." Door opens with a burst of smoke. In walks Batman. He solved all the problems on the way out. He goes, "I want to thank you, children." "You're welcome, Mr. Batman."
Yeah. We should have brought him to a couple of Senate hearings. It might have changed the difference along the way.
I know.
You know,
I missed that opportunity.
I guess I won't mention the particular senator who asked the question. But we all have
I
these
think
experiences.
you and I have the same senator in mind.
But I had been in the Senate about a month, and out of the blue, the senator was highly critical of me in a speech that I had given about something, and just unannounced at a committee hearing. And I got back to my office and I wrote the senator a note, and I said my wonderful mother, Mary Grace Murphy, told me to, "George, make my own judgments about people in life." And I said, "I was warned about you," and I guess they were right. You are the SOB that many people talked about along the way, and frankly, probably just as well it happened when it did. But I don't want to ever see
Did
it
you respond?
again. I sent the letter. Within about 10 minutes, that senator was standing in front of me at my desk in my office. He's saying, "I apologize profusely. It will never, ever happen again." And I don't think we ever voted together on a single issue in the next 30 years.
But you got along well.
But it was a teaching moment, both for me and for him at the time.
Well, and some senators can make really bad mistakes, like one, no longer there. In the Washington paper, they said he'd been voted the dumbest member of the U.S. Senate. And to prove the point, he called a press conference to say, "I'm not the dumbest member of the Senate." And of course, the obvious first question is, well, if you're not, who is? I gotta go.
On the way. Anyway, next question. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My name is Praveen Amar. I live in Lexington, Massachusetts with my wife, who's taking pictures there. But anyway, you may not remember me. I testified before your Democratic Policy Committee 17 years ago on Mercury mission. But I have a very different question to ask you. The whole issue of Electoral College, 538. I'm not a lawyer, but I believe the sovereignty lies with person, you, me, citizen, not with the state of Massachusetts, not with Vermont, but all the 300 million people. So one person won't vote would have avoided all the issues we had in Florida election, what happened with Hillary Clinton, Trump, and now with Trump and Biden. If you notice, these elections are held only in 5, 6, 7 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and you can count the other 4. But 50 states, elections should be based on all 50 states. All people, one person, one vote. So I'm wondering, your service in the U.S. Senate over the years, how much effort you have made or other senators have made to change this whole electoral college system? I know the history, I'm sure
I
you have.
think it's probably building now because, well, you take, for example, President Trump elected first time over Hillary Clinton, and she got millions more votes than he did.
Exactly.
The same with Joe Biden, got
Exactly.
5 million more than Trump, I think. And in this case, he did win, but they only talk about the very few votes in the Electoral College. I think there was a time when they thought the Electoral College was the only way states could be recognized. That may have been then. Today, with instant media, internet and everything else, I think every vote should count, not to the Electoral College, but to who wins the presidency.
We have a question from online. For both senators, given your location, who would you nominate this year for a Profile and Courage Award?
I nominated Les. I'm on the board of the Profiles and Courage Committee, and I was one of the people who nominated Liz Cheney.
I think if I was there, I'd second the nomination.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other issues, and I never served with her in the Congress directly, and I disagree again on a number of issues she's embraced, but she is my champion right now for the most serious issue our country has faced in my lifetime, and her courage and her determination are worthy of the distinction. She gave a great talk from this very room. She gave one of the remarks was just delightful. I love the sense of humor about her. She said she was delightful to be here and to thank the Kennedy Library for honoring with this distinction of the Profiles and Courage Award. She said, you probably don't know this, but you're very much responsible, people in this room, for my father's success in politics. And he said, well, in the 1950s, my father was a high school student in Wyoming, and a young senator from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy spoke at the high school. And my father came home and was so excited about public service and making a difference that he got involved in politics. So thank you to the Kennedy family for getting my father launched in American politics.
I didn't know that story. That's a good one. Can I quote you on that, Chris?
I'm sorry?
Can I quote you on that?
Yeah, no.
I love it.
Yes.
How do you manage compromise with someone like Mitch McConnell, who doesn't give the impression of being interested in compromise at all?
Patrick?
I didn't hear it.
How do you compromise with someone like Mitch McConnell, who doesn't seem to compromise at all?
Sometimes there are areas you could reach. We have the War Victims Fund, which I just call it the War Victims Fund. And last time they were in the majority, he had it renamed the Leahy War Victims Fund, even though we were opposed on most things. He's also joined me on my efforts to ban landmines. There are some who are so ideologically tuned on things. I've served with a couple of them, like Jesse Helms. I think it's impossible to. But I've had a number of pieces of legislation where Republicans who may vote against me on most other things have joined me on some of those. Freedom of Information Act, which I've helped write and renew every time it's been renewed, it allows, no matter whether you have a Republican or a Democratic administration, people can get information what's going on. I've been joined as my chief co-sponsor, John Cornyn of Texas, who's very conservative. he has stuck with me when it's been a Republican administration as well as a Democratic administration and vice versa. So there are some areas. Try to find some areas. It doesn't mean you're going to be together with others, but try to find some areas. I know in the 16,000 plus votes I've cast, some of the most successful were where we found some area. We may be apart on all others, but we found some areas that we can come together. That's what the Senate's going to have to do. I'm very afraid that the Senate continues where a group may dictate what they must vote, the country falls apart. That same thing is happening in the U.S. Supreme Court now, and we have got to stand up to that.
Let me respond to your question, which is a great question. I'll just tell you two quick anecdotes. The day I left the United States Senate, January 3rd, 2011, I was hanging around to watch the new members be sworn in. Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut succeeded me in the seat, and it was an emotional moment. I've spent 30 years of my life in that chamber, and my last day, and watching it all unfold, a newly elected Republican senator came up, who I knew a little bit, and he said, "Okay, so what's your big advice?" He said, "You're leaving, I just arrived today." Kind of a shot in the ribs more than anything else. I don't know if it was a serious question, but I took it as a serious question. And I said, I'm gonna look over here on the Democratic side and look at what you probably consider the radical left of the country sitting in the chamber. I said, you're not gonna have much to do as a Republican. We were in the majority. You're not gonna have much to do for the first year. I would advise you take each one of these people out you think are nuts, too far to the left, and have either breakfast, lunch, or dinner with them. And I promise you 3 things will happen. One, I don't want to scare you, but you're actually going to like each other because you've been through similar paths to get here. So you'll have something in common. Secondly, you're going to agree on a lot more than you can imagine. Despite what people think, there's a lot more in common you actually have. You may approach differently things along the way. And thirdly, if you do the first 2, you'll work together, and then this job becomes not only interesting but worthwhile. And I learned that lesson slowly. I didn't embrace it when I first got it. I thought that I was right on everything, and everyone ought to get in line and support what I want to do. What the hell's the matter with you if you don't understand the logic of my brilliance, my ideas? I discovered very quickly that didn't happen very easily on the way. And I learned a lesson, and again, I'll leave the name out, but there was a very conservative member of the Senate, and I didn't really have any faith that he would join me in anything, but he was on the floor of the Senate. I was looking for co-sponsors. I always believed eventually to have a Republican co-sponsor helped if you could find someone who would join you. And I went up to this member and I said, look, I'm trying to lift the travel restrictions on Cuba, and I've got, I think, a number of votes. I'd like you to be my Republican co-sponsor. Well, he said, okay, give me your best shot. I'll never forget the language. So I gave my best shot. I said, I don't think Castro would last 6 months if you start open the door here and all the things. I got all through, and he said, put me on the bill. Put you on the bill? I said, was it my logic? Was it the brilliance of my speech? He said, no, I got a bunch of rice farmers who want to sell in Cuba. That's the reason I want to be on the bill. Well,
I know what he's talking about.
I learned a lesson in that moment that why people will support you on something may have nothing to do with your argument. But if they have a different argument that you can live with, that's okay. And so I learned in terms of building these coalitions, you don't have to insist that everyone agree with all your reasoning for something if they will agree with you on the point you're trying to make. And you've got to work at that. If you assume it happens magically, it doesn't. You've got to work at it. You've got to get to know people, spend time with them. You'll find out they're interesting. They have ideas you agree with. You find, at least on one subject matter, you maybe can do something together on. If you don't do that, it doesn't happen and you get what you got, in a sense. Now, I'm not suggesting this new crowd would even come around on something like that, but that's when it worked, because you spent the time to knock on the door and ask for people their thoughts and views. And invariably, you'll find that people you never imagined in a million years would agree. It doesn't happen all the time, obviously, but it happens from time to time. And when it does, it's magical. It's magical in each of our lives, whether it's your family member, your neighbors, your coworkers, or your colleague in the United States Senate. Pat was a master at it, and he was so successful at what he did because he paid the time and the patience to listen to people that he otherwise disagreed with. That's how it's supposed to work. And this guy right here did it brilliantly for 46 years. Yes.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Harris, and I have a question for Leahy. I know you take a lot of photos, and why not just do a photo book? And how did you get into photography as a whole?
Well,
Great question.
some things I can't do. Having been born blind in one eye, I don't have really great depth perception, so a lot of sports are out. I love riding my bicycle and hiking and all that, but the lack of depth perception, that baseball you think is 5 feet away, maybe 5 inches away, and that doesn't always work well. But you only need one eye for photography. And from a very early age, I go back to my collection of cameras. I got a Hopalong Cassidy camera. Does anybody even know who Hopalong Cassidy? Thank you. I see a few gray-haired people who do. But, and my mother loved taking photographs. I've got her old cameras. And I just got very accustomed to it. I found that a number of the pictures, because of where I was, newspapers and news magazines and news companies would buy the photographs, and again, every cent of that went to that same children's library. And I just loved it. It was one thing that I could really conquer with just one eye. And as Marcel knows, I never go anywhere without a camera. There's a camera with a big telephoto lens on it sitting in my briefcase right now.
Well, you made a great contribution with him, because you could always see Patrick, as things were gathering around, taking someone's picture along the way. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, someone told me, I think over the years, maybe not just your Senate years, or maybe just the Senate years, there's a collection of something like 150,000 photographs that Patrick Leahy took of his colleagues in moments of history in the Senate. So teasingly, where there are a lot of pictures in this book, and it's because I'll never forgive him for not including me in one, but putting that aside.
I got hundreds of pictures of you. But
this is just a small sample of because he's not in a lot of these pictures in the book because he took them. And so it was a great contribution. Howard Baker, senator from Tennessee, was also a shutterbug. And so between the two of them, they had really a wonderful collection.
Well, Howard's the one that, first time I went down to the White House, I went with him. And of course, I was literally the junior most member of the Senate. And he's taking pictures. I said, Republican White House. I said, gosh, I wonder if they let a Democrat do that. He said, sure, bring your camera, just don't use the flash.
Yeah.
So that, I've taken pictures there ever since. There's one fun one in there of George H.W. Bush wearing a Mickey Mouse hat.
With Don Riegel in the picture.
And I just close with this one. Ronald and Nancy Reagan's their favorite picture of his second inaugural, full page on a news magazine. They both liked it. They said, we ought to call the photographer. Who is it? It said, photo by Patrick Leahy. He said, what a coincidence. Mr. President, it's not a coincidence. And he signed, he got the picture blown up and signed it to me, and we were both laughing our heads off. He said, well, wait till Nancy finds it was you who took the picture, because that's her favorite picture too.
Yeah.
In fact, he said, it's her favorite picture, so it's mine.
Yeah. That's a funny story. Yeah, right here. We'll take a last question here.
Hi there. I'm a senior at Boston College, and I recognize that I'm one of the youngest people here in this audience. But there's a lot of discussion among students about the age in politics. And you mentioned President Carter, who is, in my opinion, the best president we've ever had. And he just celebrated his 98th birthday yesterday. What do you say to people who might be my age, who say that you need to get out of politics at a certain age? Because I don't believe that's true. I think, Senator Leahy, you're the epitome of service through your entire life. What do you say to people who say you have to get out of politics at a certain age?
Well, in politics, there is a limitation of the time a president can serve. But I say we have limitations called elections. Every 2 years for members of the House, every 6 years for the Senate. And keep in mind, we had all the newspaper stories my first 3 elections how I couldn't possibly win. That's the only thing I've kept as headlines. There are two headlines 5 days apart. First one is Poll Dooms Leahy. Second is Leahy unexpectedly wins. There's always going to be changes. But then what I encourage people to do, young people, get involved. Feel free to run for something. Maybe you win, maybe you won't. I mean, when I ran at 34, it was 10 to 1 that I couldn't possibly win. But I did. And it could have been replaced at any time after 6 years. Get more young people in. We've encouraged this in our legislature in Vermont and in so many different offices. Get young people involved. But then let them know that if they want to do a good job, it's a heck of a lot of work. It may look easy because of who's there, but when you get involved, it's a lot of work. I've encouraged people in my office, go and get involved in politics. But then run for something, or work on a campaign where you really care about the man or woman who's running, and do it. But you've got to get involved and know that it's not just the great headline, oh, I won. It's what happens next. What did you accomplish?
Yeah. That's a great question, and thank you for raising it. I Patrick gave a great answer. One of my great concerns is the absence of civics in the country. I think there's only one state
in history
in the country that requires a course in civics before you get a high school diploma. There are a lot of states that do various things, but it's stunning to me what little people know about the basic structure of our system of democracy. And if we could do anything, we ought to insist upon states picking up and requiring civics classes so people are.
I agree.
You watch a new naturalized citizen talk about this country, and you listen to some people who are well into their adulthood who only know a fraction of what a new citizen knows. It's really disturbing, but I agree with them on getting young people involved, so thank you.
I agree.
And Patrick, look, this has been, Patrick, I'm deeply honored that JP and others got in touch and asked me if I'd be a part of this day today. And again, I thank you, Marcel, for all your wonderful work over the years. None of this would have happened without you and him as well. And Kevin and JP, please tell the other members of the staff, as both Patrick and I grew to appreciate, and your constituents in Vermont had the good sense year after year send you back to represent their interests. The country's been a better place because Patrick Leahy served in public life in the United States Senate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you. Good, good. I want to sign that right now.
I know, that's okay.
All right, come on.
Thank you all.
I haven't signed this.
No, you did sign it. I think you signed. I hope you signed it.